You're listening to Digi City, a cyberpunk story in 10 parts, written by Jarrett Rush and produced by SciFi in cooperation with the author. Part 4, Saxon Beach. Miller ran a thumb across the top of the photo in his pocket and scanned the faces of the kids laying slack-jawed on the floor. He rolled those he couldn't see onto their backs. He was back at Tallboy, 5th floor, home to the freakiest of the freaks. This was the floor where the data came in bullet fast, crushing whoever was on the receiving end. Most everyone plugged in on 5 was young. They weren't like the soldiers a few floors above them, using the data to forget. These kids wanted the thrill. These addicts played at the edge, looking over and taunting death every time they plugged in. Jacks here weren't in arms. They were in their necks, a shortcut to the brain that eliminated any natural slowdown that distance produced. The data was more devastating. They were wrecked faster and harder. Miller never understood the appeal. Jacking in at all was devastating enough. The floor was crowded. Miller zigzagged his way through the tangle of legs, then stopped and pulled the picture out of his pocket. It was a surveillance shot of someone, just a kid. He had hair to his shoulders and needed a bath, but his clothes looked new enough, likely provided by whoever hired him to run data. He was a walking hard drive. Load the kid's brain with data you want kept secret, give him an address, and send him on his way. Pull the data out of him once he gets wherever he's going. They dressed him up in new clothes, just so he'd be a bit presentable, and wouldn't draw the attention that data freaks usually did. No one ever wanted to admit they were working with one of those people. Cruz passed the picture of the kid across his desk, just like he had the half-dozen or so before it. "Just bring him in," Cruz said, never looking up from the file he had open on his desk. "We'll handle it all from there." Miller stared at the new face. "Have a name?" "Nope." "Know who he's been working with?" "Nope." "Know anything?" "Nope." "You've been tremendously helpful." Cruz looked up. "Not my job to be helpful. I pass you the picture and you bring him in. That's when my job starts." "So I'm noticing." Miller pocketed the picture and walked to the elevator. Miller knocked, then waited. A voice from the other side of the door. "Can we help you?" "I need to see Cousins." "Who is I?" "I'm with Roma." Locks popped. The door opened and a muscled-up thug hugging a gun to his chest greeted Miller. "Arms up, turn around," he said. Miller put up one finger to say wait, then reached around his back and pulled his gun from his waistband. He put the gun up over his head, then complied with the orders. The guy started haphazardly running his hands up and down Miller's legs, then reached around his chest. "You think I'm packing another piece?" "Precautions," the guy said as he stood. "Wait here." Fair enough, Miller thought. He walked to the large window that ran the length of the wall opposite the door. He looked down onto the floor of the hothouse. Wires sprayed out of the walls like water from a hose. Addicts laid in flat piles on the floor. Miller felt the digital scratch at the port in his arm, and he covered it with his hand. A quiet "hey" came from behind him. Miller turned. It was Jason Cousins. Jason motioned toward a back room and said, "Come with me." The room was filled with server racks and monitors. A couple keyboards hung off the racks of servers that lined the walls. Miller always marveled when he got a peek under a hothouse hood. None of the addicts slumped across the floor had any idea what it took to get their fix. Getting a hothouse like Cousins's and like Tallboy operational took an investment, one that could quickly be made back if the freaks found you and liked your feed, but an investment nonetheless. "How's business been?" Miller asked. "You saw the floor," Cousins said. "Looked crowded." "Looks can be deceiving." Cousins pulled a keyboard down and began typing. Miller watched as the code stretched out on a monitor in front of him. A long line of gibberish. "Things are picking up, but a bunch of you Roma guys keep coming around. The shootout put us on your radar, it appears. That, or it made us a brighter blip. And your friends aren't subtle either. They like to push their weight around. We could have survived the shootout. I don't know that we'll survive the frequent visits." "I'm sorry about that." Miller took a seat in a chair in the corner. "It's not your fault," Cousins said. He struck a final key with added gusto, then hung the keyboard back on its rack and took a seat on the desktop across from Miller. "So, why are you here?" "Need a little help." Miller pulled the picture of the runner from his pocket and passed it to Cousins. "You recognize him?" Cousins studied the picture for a minute and then started to nod. Seen him a few times. Nice kid, struggling but not his fault. He used to be a soldier but got sideways after he got out. Got the governor on his port cracked and spent a long time strung out, but he's trying to head back in the right direction. I'd still see him out on the floor occasionally. When he came through here, he wasn't working for Roma, but that doesn't mean he hadn't. Seen him lately? Not in a while. Miller took the picture back. Thanks. He turned and headed back out the way he came in. Cousins followed. Halfway to the door, Miller stopped. He dug in his pocket for his reader. He pulled it out, punched up a picture on the screen. It was Chris. Recognize him? Miller asked. Cousins took a quick look at the screen and shook his head. Not ringing any bells. Sorry. Miller nodded his thanks for the help and left. The thug with the gun closed the door behind him. Miller got a few steps down the hall when Cousins called out from behind him. Try Saxon Beach. Cousins was hanging half out of the door. That first kid could be there. Think so? Cousins nodded. He'd always leave sand behind, worth a shot. Miller sat on a bench at Saxon Beach. Waves rolled gently onto the sand. Food wrappers and plastic bags spun in the breeze. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed home. 5 rings. Carrie must have been asleep. I woke you, didn't I? Miller asked after a groggy hello from the other end. It's okay. Everything all right? Yeah, I'm fine. I just wanted to check in while I had a minute. I'm out at Saxon Beach. I got another kid to chase from Cruz. Saxon Beach? Be careful. Nothing good happens out there. Sheets rustled. I'll be fine. There's nobody here. That was a lie, but only barely. A guy slept on the sand out closer to the water, probably recovering from a fix picked up at some small-time hothouse nearby, Miller thought. Same thing for the 2 guys off to his left. I was hoping this would be my last stop of the night, that my guy would be sitting in the sand. I could bring him in, then come home. No such luck? No, I have go back into Digi City. Miller stared out at the horizon. The orange glow of morning was starting to push aside the dark. How's Hope? Sleeping. Adorable. Well, hopefully I'll see you 2 soon. I hope so, Carrie said. Stay safe. Always, Miller said, and disconnected the call. He hesitated before getting up from the bench. The animals in the hills behind him protested the coming of another day. The Alcatraz bobbed up and down on the waves a few hundred yards offshore, and the lights from the ship got lost in the coming sun. Miller's thoughts turned to the last time he was at Saxon Beach, before everyone gave it over to the freaks, back when it was still a place to come on the weekends with family. The kids could play in the water. Mom could read a cheap dime store novel under an umbrella. Dad could spend the day chasing toddlers across the sand. It's what Miller expected from Saxon Beach. It's what Miller expected from life. Nothing elaborate, just normal. He'd spun out thoughts of being a little older. He and Carrie would spread out blankets on the sand, her in a wide hat with a floppy brim, big, bug-eyed glasses that hid most of her face propped on her nose. She'd have some thick paperback in her hand, one of the thrillers she liked so well about a woman with a hidden past that was unraveling spectacularly. He'd be half reading something a little more sinister, while also trying to keep an eye on the kids out by the water, shouting every few minutes to not throw sand at your sister. The last time he'd been here with Carrie, dreaming about their future, the Alcatraz or the half-dozen other ships moored off the coast weren't there yet to block their view of the horizon. That evening, as the sun sank into the water and the heat warmed their faces, Miller had slipped off the bench and onto a knee. He'd pulled a ring from his pocket. Carrie had nodded yes before he'd even asked the question. His normal life was about to start, he'd thought. A normal life that included walks in the park, movies on the couch, and days spent at the beach as a family. What he hadn't pictured was chaos and turmoil and idealism replacing rationality. He hadn't pictured complete collapse and a normal life becoming abnormal, becoming an impossibility. Back in the dark of Tallboy, Miller studied faces, slightly distorted from this angle and in this condition. No one resembled his kid. If he was in Tallboy, he wasn't on the 3rd floor. He might be in Demon, but Demon was hard to search. It was all bodies. People in Demon were desperate, and once they plugged in, they fell to the ground where they were standing. There was no time to register the data washing over them. It wasn't the gentle easing into the pool like you could get on some floors of Tallboy. It was a head-first dive into the deep end that crushed you immediately, an extreme version of Tallboy's 5th floor fix. Miller stepped into the bright morning and the crowd that had gathered out on the wasteland. It was thick with freaks looking to get wrecked, either before work or in place of it. He pushed his way toward Demon, looking at faces and trying to study eyes that were almost all focused on the ground. Miller ran a hand down the front of his shirt. He put the other in the front pocket of his pants, suddenly self-conscious. He was the sore thumb. No one else walking around the wasteland was dressed like him. Their clothes showed a couple days' wear, shoes were walked thin, knees were about to come through pant legs. Suddenly, the intense scrutiny he'd been giving those in this crowd felt wrong. Miller quit staring at the people nearby and kept his gaze focused far in front of him, on the crowd arriving rather than the crowd already there. That's when he saw him, the kid from the picture. He was walking with someone else, talking, heading toward Digi City, a few dozen yards away from the wasteland. Miller stepped faster. He gently pushed his way through the bodies, keeping his eyes locked on the kid. The crowd thickened and the kid slowed, suddenly aware of the sore thumb. The kid paused. Miller paused. Their eyes locked, and for a second Miller thought this could end easily. Then the kid bolted. He quickly freed himself from the crush of the people filing toward Digi City and picked up speed. Miller fought his way loose from the crowd and watched the kid turn down an alley. Miller was in front of the same alley moments later, but the kid was gone. Miller kicked at the food wrappers and drink cans left behind by addicts. He looked down the length of the alley and stepped into the narrow space between the buildings. A few steps deeper and Miller started to smell it, the same stench that he got in Tallboy. He put a hand in front of his nose. Wood just behind him cracked. He turned as a stack of pallets came down on top of him, and he heard the kid take off again. Miller got to his feet just as the kid exited the other side of the alley. He went left, and Miller sprinted the length of the alley like he was shot from a cannon. He turned left and saw the kid crest a hill. Miller came over the same hill to find the kid caught in a moment of confusion. He was 2 blocks ahead and didn't know which way to go. Right or left meant more streets and more alleys. Straight ahead, though, were the docks, still wrapped in caution tape. The kid looked behind him, spotted Miller, and bolted for the docks. Coming downhill, a full head of steam threatened to overpower Miller's coordination. The kid got to the docks and took a left toward where the construction crews were still working. Miller was closing fast and shouted instructions that were supposed to be, "Stop running, I need to talk," but came out much closer to gibberish. The kid stutter-stepped as he got closer to the caution tape. Miller dove. He caught the kid at the waist and they both fell to the concrete. They slid a foot or more and stopped with Miller half across the kid's back. He put a forearm across his neck and pushed him to the ground. Miller groped in his pocket for a zip tie. He slipped it around the kid's wrists and pulled a little tighter than normal. The kid winced. Miller took a moment to catch his breath. Those pallets hadn't fallen harmlessly. The pain was starting to register in his shoulders and his back. Miller hadn't been this close to the docks in a while. He looked at the new construction. He looked at the damage that remained. The day had become warm. Sitting in the shadows of these boats was a nice break. That's when he noticed they had an audience. People were watching from the other side of the caution tape and from the decks of the ships above. They were watching, and they weren't approving. Miller gave a half wave to everyone, acknowledging that he'd seen them staring, then grabbed the kid by the wrists and pulled him to standing.